Well, it was a couple of months ago when we were last convened here with this much of an assembly, so going back to March 6th, late night of March 6th, that Friday into early Saturday morning, and of course our community was all rocked. Our world had changed forever. The new normal of Madison was going to be a community bereft with mourning, with grief, with a sense of loss. As a man who has two adult sons myself, I couldn't begin to quantify the magnitude or the scope of what the Robinson family has been through. And to their credit, as this difficult journey began with their admonishment to the community to move forward in a constructive way with responsibility and restraint, as the decision has reached its summit today through the DA's office, they have continued to urge the community to be civically engaged, to voice that dissent, but to do it in a manner that does not fracture our city in moving forward and addressing a lot of the long-term needs that we have. I want to thank the time and the effort and the deliberative process that the district attorney took to take those extraordinary measures to ensure that a thoroughly vetted investigation was looked at copiously. I understand there are literally hundreds of documents that are in the process of being downloaded, so I really can't even begin to go into the content of those specifics, but I know full well that as a constitutional officer of the court, the district attorney takes his role extremely seriously, and I also would suggest that owing to an independent law that was established a year ago, the Department of Criminal Investigation by the State of Wisconsin Department of Justice, or otherwise known as DCI, through an awful lot of resources over an extended period of time to provide a voluminous, comprehensive report for the district attorney's attention. And for that, we're grateful for their work on this matter. I would be remiss if I hadn't said that going back to the Ferguson incidents and what that community was dealing with months ago, there was a small but dedicated group of folks of us who were coming from a cross spectrum of both law enforcement as well as not-for-profits, as far as clergy, as far as groups like the NAACP, Urban League of Madison, and a whole consortium of other interested people. And to the community's credit, our dialogue began well before March 6th, as we're striving to look at ways in which our role in the racial disparities issues that have been so chronicled for our community, how our role can be better understood and how systems improvements can be brought to bear. Well, of course, then with the events of March 6th, with the Robinson death, that sort of gave this group a renewed sense of alacrity and urgency, knowing full well that the expectations for our community moving forward were going to be ever so heightened. And with that sense of purpose and mission, I think that the group has done a great job in terms of preparing for this day, only insofar as the discussions have been robust, they've been lengthy, they've been committed, and they've been productive. And so from that standpoint, I think as you get to know one another better as people and not just as leaders of various groups, that the net gain for that is a greater sense of understanding and a greater sense that we can extend hands across the table and find some systems improvements that are workable. That is our hope. And so obviously, as a police chief who's been all too familiar with narratives that have been written in other communities, I'm hoping for a different sort of outcome from our community in the days to come. And I'm confident that those outcomes can be more constructive, given the fact that we have had the dialogue and we have had constructive engagement, and we are committed to listening to those concerns, not just for the police, but I think at the end of the day, our issues in Madison go well beyond an incident that occurred on March 6th are issues of pronounced poverty and joblessness, and an educational system that's not benefiting all of our kids. There are such a host of issues of which the police cannot address single-handedly. So that's why we're here today to, again, begin as I did back in March, to express on behalf of the City of Madison Police Department my heartfelt condolences once again to the loss of the Robinson son and friend and family member, as well as to again thank them for them casting an environment whereby we can move forward in community as community for healthier outcomes as we engage in civic dissent.
Chief, can you talk about officer safety? There's reports that there have been some credible threats made against your department, maybe gangs related.
Well, those things typically come in before or as a precursor to a lot of these big events, if you will. Whenever there's events, you seem to see heightened expectations moving through social media, social network, not untoward what we've seen or other markets have seen relative to big milestone decisions such as this. So that in and of itself isn't going to make my officers flee to some sort of bunker mindset. We just don't work that way.
Are you concerned about specific threats? Can you talk about threats that have been made against your department?
Well, we wouldn't want to air those now, because if they were continuing and ongoing, we'd be having detectives thoroughly exhaust those as leads would permit. And so I don't think that there's something that shows a sense of alarm beyond what we're not normally aware of in the day-to-day gyrations of what we do.
Chief Officer Kenny's attorney had talked about his desire to eventually return here as an officer. Can you talk about, even if you can talk about his case specifically, what the process is for getting an officer involved in shooting back on duty?
Well, again, now that the criminal culpability has been established owing to the district attorney's decision today, we still have to continue to conclude an internal investigation to see what, if anything, there may have been in terms of our administrative policy, procedures, or protocols attendant to that call that may or may not have been violated. And I suspect that will take at least another week.
Are there things that you're looking for in an internal investigation like this that the DA does not look at in a criminal investigation?
Well, I suspect that going specifically to a protocol or whatever, we know that in order for an officer to get from one side of a door to another side of a door, you can only get there through one of three methods through the Fourth Amendment, either through consent, a warrant, or exigent circumstances. So while that in and of itself may have not been fundamental to a district attorney's decision about criminal culpability, it will be to us in the terms of whether those actions were accorded the kinds of training that we accord to exigent circumstances. Things like that would be an example.
What is the protocol for when an officer will draw his weapon when entering a house or before entering a house? That's something that came up in DA Ozanne's description of the events that I hadn't heard before.
Well, an officer may always access the weapon, albeit not with an intent to fire it, if they believe that they're on the cusp or if there's a proclivity that it could go very quickly towards some imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. So that in and of itself does not rise to a level of being specious with respect to our administrative policy or procedures.
Going back to the internal review, after the Paul Heenan shooting, all these other things about Officer Harmsness's background came out that ended up leading to his firing from the department. Are those things that you will look at as well? Call logs, messaging logs, are those things you will look at with Officer Kenny? Well,
of course, that is part and parcel of that administrative internal review. And obviously, because there is still civil litigation with respect to the other officer you mentioned, I can't really go into the comments on that one.
Can you talk about a timeline of how long an internal investigation typically takes and when you expect this to be wrapped up?
Well, I hope that in the next week to 2 weeks tops, we should have a handle on it.
Chief, rally planned at 9 a.m. tomorrow
on
Williamson Street. How much do your officers know about what's planned tomorrow?
Well, probably just about as much as everybody else through the social network and Facebooking that's been, publicly noticed. Obviously, we have been contingency planning on two fronts for the last 6 weeks. One, of course, is the incident command structure, where you see, do you have the logistical bodies, do you have things in place to meet or greet any eventuality that could occur to keep the city safe. Of course, the other thing I made an earlier reference to, Pete, was that sense that working with community has been ongoing and seamless as well. My sense is that we are going to be emboldened to do well tomorrow. And the reason is that owing to the collaboration we have from this group that we have forged together through the United Way, we have had probably well over 100 adults come forward, and they're going to be wearing credentialed ID cards, and they're going to be going in real time, as we will, to any of those hot spots or congregation points where they can invoke that sort of temperance, that sort of restraint, that sort of let's do what's reasonable, and I think, quite frankly, to also be a consumer of services to say, what are the implications of the choices you make? Obviously, arrest can have some significant outcomes for a young person for the rest of their lives if they end up going to be physically, custodially arrested and put in a jail. That invokes a CCAP entry. And as we know, CCAP practically has a shelf life of plutonium waste. So even if you're acquitted or the charges are ultimately dismissed, that young person, if that's the person who's been arrested, will have to carry around that rap sheet, that record of arrests and prosecutions for the rest of his or her life. So I think what they'll be doing, and part of what I'm obviously countenancing, is that if people are going to look at, on principle, making that statement that they want to be arrested as a telltale sign of their dissent, that is, of course, their prerogative. I'm urging, of course, that they engage in those city ordinances that can still speak volumes, and it'll still hit you in the pocketbook. Your principles will definitely cost you, but that will at least, if you have an identification card with you, allow you to be cited and released at the scene as opposed to being conveyed to the jail, physically fingerprinted, mugshot, possibly a DNA swab taken, and then you have the CCAP entry. So we're obviously urging those who want to involve in civic engagement with some real teeth to it, that at least you sort of engage in those benign things that aren't going to get you arrested for criminal activity.
Chief, can we go back to the threats really quick, and can you say anything about if these were targeted to the entire department, to Officer Kenny in particular, and is there anything you want to say to folks, the public, about what kind of danger your officers or the public might want to be aware of?
Okay, so our officers, just for the record, they get in danger's way each and every time they head out the front door. So their training is to be situationally aware of that environment that they're working in, but not to the point where we develop this we versus them mindset where you have to hunker and bunker down and crawl to your squad car after briefing. Nobody can operate like that. That's paralysis. So you take those things with a grain of salt because, in fact, they're being vetted from throughout the country, and we've seen this play out. Sometimes they're real and measured. Other times they're more open-ended and obtuse. So we'll just take those and develop those intels as those leads would dictate, and then deal with them specifically. But we don't want to be alarmist about that because that isn't the kind of way we police.
Chief, have you spoken with Officer Kenny today since the DA's announcement?
I tried to. I sent him a call on his cell phone and left him a lengthy voicemail. So I hope to have contact with him later again this evening.
What did you say in the voicemail?
Well, I just wanted to tell him that the district attorney had arrived at a conclusion and there's been no finding of criminal culpability, and that I'm certain that an immense burden has been lifted from him as well, and now he can look towards sometime in the future resuming the career that he has a passion for.
Does that speak towards your internal investigation, that you haven't seen anything wrong so far?
But again, it's sort of like with the investigation that the DA has just released. I have not sort of seen a peek preview of anything at this point. That's been the purview of professional standards, so I haven't seen what findings they may have initially found. I'm going to wait for the thing to finally be baked and sent to me.
When you talk about speaking with members of the community and community leaders and sort of hearing and evaluating those sort of systems, I believe you call them systems improvements.
Mm-hmm.
Does anything stand out? Is there anything that sort of you write down on a list and say, okay, this is really something that we should work on?
Well, it's early to tell because right now there are two various committees that are sort of looking at examining the way we work. There's the county-wide initiative that's being monitored by, or initiated by, I should say, this coordinated consortium of law enforcement and non-for-profits through the United Way, and their first task is to look at use of force, procedures, protocols, and trainings. The city of Madison, as you may have already known, is also putting together a separate and distinct, reporting only to the mayor and to the alders, a separate council, if you will, or task force, that will be looking at sort of the whole picture, policy, procedures, protocol. They will not limit themselves to one subject matter niche. They will look at everything to see if there is something implicit in what we're doing that may contribute to these sort of disparate impacts that we see in our community. So from that standpoint, you know, when you've had the same document and it's on the website, it's as plain as the nose on your face when it's yours. Now perhaps a new set of eyes, a new set of opinions, we look forward to seeing what they might offer us that we haven't seen for ourselves.
Chief, about tomorrow's gathering.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm sure you remember the East Washington Avenue being closed for a long amount of time. Is something like that a possibility again? I mean, for the average commuter, person coming to and from work, what should they expect tomorrow in terms of traffic and stoppages?
Well, we do take these on a case-by-case basis. We don't go in with a preordained notion. And as I understand it from what I've seen on the Facebook postings, this is not an isolated incident unique unto Madison itself. This is part of a sort of a national awareness of things of this matter. So we will provide a little latitude, but it depends on the time of day, it depends on the place, the intersection, how difficult it is to reroute. Will be reasonable, but not as reasonable as it took us to take East Washington Avenue back. That was too long.
I know you've been very busy today, obviously, but can you talk a little bit about, I mean, what kind of activity you've heard of today at all? I know it seems like there's some crowds gathering on Williamson Street. Have you heard of anything else?
No, nothing at all. As a matter of fact, the only thing that we know that's going to be a coordinated response is I believe it's a multi-denominational clergy movement, an initiative that's going to start at Willie Street and do a peace march up to the square ultimately, maybe perhaps by the city-county building, but that's what we do best. We're fine with that. Anything else?